I called the insurance company to cancel my late husband's life insurance policy, and the agent on the other end went completely silent. Then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, before we do anything, I need to ask, have you ever filed a claim on this policy?" I told her no. There was nothing to file. The policy was from years ago, barely worth the monthly premium. I'd been meaning to cancel it for months and kept putting it off the way you put off anything that carries the weight of grief attached to it. She asked me to hold. I stood in my kitchen in Brentwood, Tennessee, still in the clothes I'd worn to work that day, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to elevator music and thinking about nothing in particular. I was 51 years old. I drove a 2018 Subaru Forester. I taught high school English for 22 years before taking a curriculum coordinator position at the district office. I was not a woman who expected the floor to drop out from under her on a Tuesday afternoon. The agent came back. Her name was Kelsey, or that's what she'd said when she answered. Her voice had changed register. Careful now, professional in a different way than before. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I'm going to need to transfer you to our Policy Services Department. There's something on this account that needs to be reviewed before any changes can be made." I asked her what she meant. She said she wasn't able to discuss it, but that someone from that department would be able to help me, and that it was. She paused here. Important that I speak with them before making any decisions about the account. The hold music came back. I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, my neighbor was mowing his lawn in long, even rows. The sun was doing that late afternoon thing, where it comes through the window at an angle and makes everything look amber and still, everything the same. Ordinary Tuesday. Except that the woman on the phone had just told me, in the most professional way possible, that something was wrong. My husband, Raymond Calloway, had died 14 months earlier. A stroke. He was 56. It happened on a Thursday morning while he was getting ready for work, and by the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing to be done. We had been married for 28 years. He was a commercial property developer. We had a good life, a quiet life, the kind where you know exactly what's in every drawer and cupboard and account. Or so I believed. The man from Policy Services was named Arthur Denning. He had the measured, careful voice of someone who spent his days delivering information that rearranged people's lives. He confirmed my identity. Then he confirmed Raymond's date of birth, our address, the last 4 digits of Raymond's Social Security number. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway, are you aware that there is an active claim on this policy that was initiated 18 months ago?" I told him that wasn't possible. Raymond had been alive 18 months ago. Arthur Denning was quiet for a moment. "The claim was not filed in connection with a death benefit," he said. "This is a whole life policy with an accumulated cash value component. 18 months ago, a request was made to access a portion of that cash value. The request was approved and the funds were disbursed." I asked him how much. "The disbursement," he said, "was for $340,000. I didn't say anything." "Mrs. Calloway, are you still there?" I was still there. I was sitting at my kitchen table, watching my neighbor finish the last row of his lawn, and I was trying to understand what I had just been told. Raymond had accessed $340,000 from a life insurance policy 6 months before his stroke. I had never heard of this policy having that kind of cash value. I had never been told. I had never signed anything. Arthur Denning told me that the current remaining cash value on the policies after the disbursement and continued accumulation was $218,000. He told me that as the named beneficiary, I had the right to claim both the death benefit and the remaining cash value, and that given Mr. Calloway's death, the full account was now in my name to do with as I chose. He also told me that the $340,000 disbursement had been sent to an account he was not able to identify from his end, and that I might want to look into where those funds had gone before deciding anything. I thanked him in a voice I did not recognize as my own. I told him I would call back. I set the phone face down on the table. The lawnmower outside had stopped. I sat in that silence for a long time. Raymond had been a careful man. That was the word everyone used at his funeral. Careful, methodical, steady. He paid our bills on time, kept meticulous records, balanced the household budget in a spreadsheet he updated every Sunday. We had a joint checking account, a joint savings account, a retirement fund, and a mortgage that we'd paid off 3 years before he died. I knew our financial life the way I knew our house, every room, every corner. Except, apparently, not every room. I got up and went to the fireproof box we kept in the closet off the master bedroom. I had been through it once after the funeral to handle the estate, life insurance policy, retirement account, car titles, the deed to the house. Everything neat and labeled the way Raymond kept everything. I pulled out the insurance folder. There were 2 policies. One I knew, a term life policy we'd taken out together years ago that I'd already filed a claim on and received. The other was a whole life policy issued to Raymond individually, purchased 12 years ago. I was listed as beneficiary. I had never seen this document before. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it. It was real. It was properly executed. Raymond's signature, his handwriting, and in the coverage details, language about accumulated cash value, loan provisions, and partial disbursement options. He had taken out a policy worth, at the time of purchase, approximately $500,000. He had never mentioned it to me. Not once. Not in 12 years. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, and I looked at the ceiling, and I did the thing I had not allowed myself to do in 14 months of widowhood, which was to ask questions I did not want the answers to. Raymond had been a good husband. I believed that with the certainty of a person who has lived alongside someone for almost 3 decades. But I was also beginning to understand that certainty and truth are not always the same thing. I had been certain about the term policy. I had not been certain, apparently, about everything. Where had $340,000 gone? I was at the library when it opened at 9 the next morning. I had not searched from my home computer. I couldn't have told you exactly why. Instinct, maybe. Or the particular kind of caution that arrives with certain kinds of information. I started with what I knew. Raymond's company, Calloway Development LLC, was registered in Tennessee. I had been through the business records after his death. His partner, a man named Stuart Finch, had bought out Raymond's share of the company 6 months after the funeral, under a buy-sell agreement they'd had in place for years. That had been straightforward. Stuart had been professional, even kind, through the whole process. I had signed the paperwork and received a buyout sum of $180,000, which I had added to our savings without much thought. What I had not done was look closely at what had happened to Calloway Development in the 2 years before Raymond's death. I searched Stuart Finch. His name came up in connection with several commercial development projects in Middle Tennessee, mostly retail strip centers and small office parks, the same kind of work Raymond had always done. Nothing unusual. But then a third name kept appearing alongside Stuart's in the records. A man named Dex Holloway, listed as a consultant on at least 4 projects over the past 3 years. I had never heard that name. I searched Dex Holloway. What came back was thin. A LinkedIn profile with no photo, listing him as a financial consultant based out of Nashville. An LLC registered in Delaware called Holloway Capital Partners. A brief mention in a local business journal from 4 years ago, describing him as a development finance specialist, and then nothing, no website, no substantial press. The kind of digital footprint that is either a sign of extreme privacy or deliberate obscurity. I wrote down everything I had and drove home. That evening, my daughter called. Her name is June Calloway. She's 26, lives in Austin, works in tech, calls me every Sunday without fail. I had not told her about the insurance policy. I was not ready. June adored her father, and I would not say something I couldn't unsay until I understood what I was actually dealing with. I needed a lawyer, not the estate attorney I had used after Raymond died. A man named Harold Peterson, who had been Raymond's contact for 20 years. Someone Raymond had chosen. I understood now why that distinction mattered. I asked a colleague at the district office, a woman I trusted named Beverly Cross, who she would call if she needed someone to handle something complicated and financial. She gave me a name without hesitation, Suzanne Morhart. She handled financial fraud and estate matters out of a firm in Green Hills. She's the one you want when something doesn't add up. I called Suzanne Morhart's office the next morning and had an appointment by Thursday afternoon. Her office was clean and deliberately calm, the kind of space that was designed to make you feel like things could be managed. Suzanne herself was in her late 40s, black, with natural hair, and the particular quality of attention that made you feel every word you said was being weighed and filed. She was not warm in the conventional sense. She was better than warm. She was focused. I laid everything out for her. The call to cancel the policy, Arthur Denning, the $340,000 disbursement, the 12-year-old whole life policy I had never been shown, Dex Holloway, Holloway Capital Partners, Stuart Finch. I brought the printouts. I brought the fireproof box. I told her everything in the order it had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. Do you know what Calloway Development was working on in the 18 months before your husband's stroke? I told her I knew in general terms, a mixed-use development in Murfreesboro, a retail project in Hendersonville, but not in detail. And the buyout you received from Stuart Finch. Did you have independent counsel review that agreement? I had not. Stuart had been kind. I had trusted the process. Suzanne's expression didn't change, but she set her pen down once on the legal pad in a way that told me everything. The $340,000, she said, was the number she was most interested in. A disbursement that large from a whole life policy, made 6 months before the policyholder's death, to an account she could not immediately identify. That was not nothing. That was a deliberate move. The question was why Raymond had needed $340,000 outside of any account I was aware of, and where it had gone. She wanted to bring in a forensic accountant she worked with regularly, a woman named Barbara So, formerly with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I agreed. I went back to my ordinary life and waited. But ordinary had acquired a new texture. I began noticing things. A car I did not recognize, a gray Honda Pilot, parked on the street across from my house twice in 1 week. A voicemail from a number I didn't know, a man saying he was an old colleague of Raymond's who had heard I was going through some difficult estate matters and would love to connect. I did not call back. I forwarded the voicemail to Suzanne. Barbara So worked quickly and without drama. 3 weeks after I retained her, she called me into Suzanne's office and sat across from me with a folder and the manner of a woman who had delivered hard findings before and understood that clarity was kinder than softening. Holloway Capital Partners, she told me, had functioned for 5 years as a mechanism for redirecting development fee overages from Callaway Development's projects. The arrangement worked like this. On certain projects, particularly the larger mixed-use developments, costs were reported to investors and lenders at inflated figures. The difference between the inflated figures and the actual costs was redirected through Holloway Capital as consulting fees. Raymond and Stuart Finch were both parties to the arrangement. Dex Holloway was the architect. He held the Delaware LLC, managed the fund flows, and distributed the proceeds. The $340,000 that Raymond had accessed from his life insurance policy was not the money going in. It was the money going out. Raymond had, in the final months before his stroke, attempted to begin returning funds, or, more precisely, to move his share of the proceeds out of the arrangement before something came apart. The disbursement had gone to Holloway Capital Partners. Raymond had been pulling back. Dex Holloway had been, Barbara believed, pressuring him to do so. Raymond had known what he was doing was wrong. That much was clear from the internal emails Barbara had obtained through a subpoena connected to a parallel civil matter she had found in her research. He had written to Dex Holloway 6 weeks before his stroke, saying that he wanted to resolve the arrangement, that he was uncomfortable with the exposure, and that he had a family he was not willing to jeopardize. Dex Holloway had written back, "You're already exposed, Raymond. We all are. Clean exits don't exist. We manage this together, or we don't manage it at all." Raymond had died 9 weeks later. I sat in Suzanne's office with that email in my hand and felt the floor shift in a way I had thought I was prepared for but was not. The man I had been married to for 28 years had been participating in financial fraud. He had known it was wrong. He had tried to get out. He had not told me. I did not know how to hold all of that at once. I set it down and picked it up and set it down again for weeks. I went to work. I answered emails. I sat on my porch in the evenings with a glass of water, and I let myself feel the specific and terrible grief of losing someone a second time, not to death, but to the discovery that what you thought you knew had a room in it you were never allowed to enter. Suzanne's advice was direct. We needed to move before Dex Holloway did. The insurance disbursement and my status as beneficiary on both the remaining cash value and the death benefit were legally mine. But if Holloway or the civil matter Barbara had found moved first with a claimant's the estate, my position could become complicated. We needed to get ahead of it. The plan had 2 parts. First, Suzanne would contact the IRS Criminal Investigation Division voluntarily, disclosing what Barbara had found and offering me as a cooperative, non-participating witness. Second, she would petition to reopen Raymond's estate on the grounds that assets had been omitted from the original filing, specifically, the whole life policy and its full history. We moved on a Wednesday. Suzanne filed the petition. Barbara submitted her findings summary. By Friday, Suzanne had spoken with an agent named Graves at the Nashville field office who received the disclosure without fanfare and told us to hold pending review. I drove home that evening and made dinner. Lemon chicken and rice, the same thing I made every Friday without thinking about it. I sat at the table and ate alone and thought, I have done something today that cannot be undone. There was grief in that. There was also, for the first time in weeks, something that felt like solid ground. The phone rang on a Sunday morning. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was Nashville. I almost didn't answer. Helen, just my first name. said in a tone of voice I had not heard directed at me before, the particular tone of a man who believed his patience was a form of threat. Dex Holloway, he did not waste time. He said he understood I had been going through Raymond's affairs, and that there might be some confusion about certain financial matters connected to the business. He said he had always had great respect for Raymond and great sympathy for what I was going through. He said he hoped we could talk, friend to friend, before things became complicated. I asked him what he meant by complicated. He said that Raymond had made certain financial arrangements that were, in his words, difficult to explain out of context. That those arrangements involved funds that were technically in transit. That if an outside party, a government agency, for instance, were to look at those arrangements without the proper context, a grieving widow who had unknowingly benefited from years of her husband's income might find herself in an uncomfortable position. It was a threat dressed in the language of concern, the most dangerous kind. I told him I had an attorney and that all future communication should go through her office. I ended the call. Then I sat on the couch and did not move for about 10 minutes because my hands were not cooperating. Then I called Suzanne and told her every word. She was not surprised. The fact that he called you directly tells me he doesn't have clean legal standing. If he did, he'd have lawyers do the talking. A week later, through Suzanne's office, Dex Holloway's attorney made contact, requesting a meeting to discuss estate matters. Suzanne declined. 2 days after that, Stuart Finch called me. We had not spoken since the buyout paperwork, 18 months earlier. His voice was warm in a way that was immediately suspicious, the warmth of a man who needed something. He said he was worried about me. Said he had heard through the grapevine that I was dealing with some issues related to Raymond's estate. Said Raymond had been like a brother to him, and he wanted to make sure I was okay. I thought about what Suzanne had told me. Let them talk, document everything, commit to nothing. I thanked him for calling. I said I was managing. I said I had legal counsel handling the estate details and that everything was moving through the appropriate channels. I said it pleasantly, without emphasis. The silence on his end told me he'd understood. I took 3 days off work and drove to Chattanooga to stay with my sister, Margot. I didn't tell her the full situation. I kept the financial details private on Suzanne's advice. I told her I was dealing with complicated estate business and needed to be somewhere that wasn't my house for a few days. Margot has a porch that faces the Tennessee River, and she didn't ask too many questions, which was exactly what I needed. I sat on that porch and I let myself stop managing things for 72 hours. I watched the water and I thought about Raymond. Not the Raymond I was discovering now, but the one I had known. The one who coached June's soccer team every Saturday for 3 years, who learned to make my mother's biscuit recipe after she passed because he knew it mattered to me, who sat with me in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours during a health scare of my own and did not once make me feel like I was inconveniencing him. That man had also been the man who took out a hidden policy and participated in financial fraud and did not tell me. Both of those things were true. I was learning to hold them both without letting one cancel out the other. My neighbor back home, a retired history teacher named Carolyn Brewer, left a foil-covered dish on my porch the evening I got back. Baked ziti with a card that said, "Didn't know you were going through something hard, but figured food was a safe guess." I stood on the porch holding that dish and felt the particular undoing that comes from unexpected small kindness in the middle of large difficulty. I cried a little. Then I put the ziti in the refrigerator and checked my phone. There was an email from Stuart Finch's personal address, not his business email, his personal one. The subject line was, "Just checking in." The message was warm, casual, and, reading it 3 times, carefully constructed to feel like friendship while containing no actual information. He asked if I'd be open to a coffee sometime. "Just to talk about Raymond," he said. He missed him. He thought it might be good for both of us. I forwarded it to Suzanne with a 1-line note. "Is this connected?" She called within the hour. She had already found the connection herself. Stuart Finch and Dex Holloway had known each other for over a decade, well before Callaway development. Stuart had introduced Raymond to Dex years ago, which was how the arrangement had begun. And in the civil matter Barbara had located, Stuart was named as a co-respondent. His buyout of Raymond's share of the business, the $180,000 he had paid me, was now being examined as potentially undervalued, given what the business had actually been generating. "What does he want?" I asked. "He wants to know what you know and what you've shared," Suzanne said. "He's not sure whether the envelope you've opened contains his name or not." I wrote back to Stuart. I thanked him for thinking of me. I said I was in the middle of some legal matters related to the estate that kept my schedule unpredictable, but that I appreciated him reaching out and would be in touch when things settled. He replied within 15 minutes, completely warm, absolutely no pressure. "Of course," he said. He'd be here whenever I needed. The speed of the reply told me what I needed to know. I did not write back again. What I did in those weeks was find a therapist on Suzanne's suggestion. A woman named Dr. Patricia Hull, whose practice was near the district office and who specialized in what she called life transition and financial trauma. Seeing her every 2 weeks became an anchor in a stretch of time that had very little anchoring. She said something in our 3rd session that I have thought about many times since. "The fact that Raymond hid this from you doesn't mean your marriage wasn't real," she said. "It means he made decisions about what you were allowed to know. That's not a reflection of your judgment. That's a reflection of his choices." I had needed to hear that. I had been carrying, without quite acknowledging it, a particular shame. The shame of a woman who had been fooled, who had not seen, who had loved without knowing. Dr. Hull helped me understand that I had not failed to see. I had been deliberately prevented from seeing. That distinction, small as it might sound, made a very large difference. Agent Graves at the IRS contacted Suzanne with an update. A formal investigation into Holloway Capital Partners had been opened. My cooperative status was noted. Barbara's financial summary had been incorporated into the investigation file. It would take time, Graves said. These things always did. Dex Holloway's side went quiet. No more direct calls, no more lawyers making collegial inquiries. But I was not naive enough to think he'd stopped. Men like Dex Holloway, and I was learning with some pain that Stuart Finch was also in that category, did not walk away from exposure without trying every door first. They were recalculating. I made sure my doors were locked. I documented everything. I called Suzanne every week. And I waited with a steadiness that surprised me because I had not considered myself a particularly steady person before all of this began. But there is a particular calm that comes not from the absence of threat, but from knowing exactly what you have done and why. I had told the truth. I had gone to the right people. I had not made deals I would regret. Whatever came next, that part was solid. They came on a Saturday morning. Stuart Finch and a woman I did not immediately recognize, pulling up in a rented black SUV. I watched from the kitchen window as they got out. Stuart looked the same as always. silver-haired, well-dressed, the practiced ease of a man who had built a professional life on first impressions. The woman with him was younger, maybe 40, in a blazer, and carrying what appeared to be a portfolio case. I recognized her when they reached the front walk. Her name was Amber Caulfield. She had been Raymond's bookkeeper for 11 years. I opened the door before they knocked. Stuart opened his arms slightly, a gesture of warmth that was also, I notice now, a test of whether I would step forward into it. I did not. "Helen, you look wonderful." "Stuart." "Amber." He said they'd been thinking about me. Said they were sorry for not reaching out sooner, that grief was complicated, that they wanted to make sure I was okay. Amber said she had some documents she thought might be helpful for the estate, things she'd found when closing out the business files. She held up the portfolio case. I let them in because Suzanne had told me to. Let them come to you. Let them show their hand. We sat in the living room. Amber set the portfolio case on the coffee table without opening it. Stuart did the talking. He talked about Raymond, about their partnership, their friendship, the ways the commercial development market had changed in recent years, the pressures that created. He used the language of shared burden, of good men navigating difficult circumstances, of decisions that looked different in context than they did from the outside. He was skilled. I had to give him that. Then he said, "Helen, some of what you've been looking into, and I completely understand why you've been looking. Some of it is more complicated than it appears on the surface. The arrangement with Dex's firm, for instance, there are aspects of that the government won't have the full picture on. And the way you're handling this right now, going through official channels without really understanding what you're dealing with, it could put you in a position that's very uncomfortable. Raymond wouldn't have wanted that. Raymond wouldn't have wanted that." I looked at Stuart. I looked at Amber, who was watching me carefully with the expression of a woman who had rehearsed what she was about to say. Then I looked back at Stuart and I said, "Are you asking me to withdraw my cooperation with a federal investigation?" He shifted. He said he was asking me to consider a more private resolution, one that protected all parties, one that recognized my position and compensated me accordingly for any disruption. He glanced at Amber, who unzipped the portfolio case and slid a document across the coffee table. It was a proposed settlement agreement. The number on it was $95. I did not touch it. Stuart was watching me with the particular expression of a man who believed that everyone, eventually, made the practical choice. I stood up. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I'll let my attorney know you visited and that you presented a written document. Please direct anything further to her office." Stuart's composure held but barely. He stood slowly. He said that he hoped I understood what I was choosing. He said the government would take its time, and during that time, my name would be attached to an investigation, and that was not easy for anyone. "I know," I said. I held the door open. They left. I closed the door and stood with my back against it and breathed carefully for about 30 seconds. Then I picked up my phone and called Suzanne and told her everything, including the settlement document, which I had photographed before they left. Suzanne was not surprised. A written settlement offer in that context, she told me, was significant. It meant they were worried. People who are not worried don't put numbers on paper. The deposition took place in February, 8 months after my call to cancel the policy. A federal building in Nashville, downtown. A conference room with a long table and the flat, official atmosphere of a room where things become permanent. Barbara So was there. Suzanne was there. 2 agents from IRS Criminal Investigation, including Graves, and a DOJ attorney named Michael Abernathy, who had joined the case 2 months earlier. I had been deposed 6 weeks before, alone with Suzanne and the government attorneys, answering everything they asked. I had told the truth at every turn, because the truth was the only thing I had that was entirely mine. Dex Holloway was deposed separately. Stuart Finch was deposed separately. Amber Caulfield was interviewed as a material witness. I was not present for any of those sessions, but Suzanne kept me informed in pieces over the days that followed. What I understood from those pieces was this: Dex Holloway arrived with 3 attorneys and the confidence of a man who had navigated difficult rooms before. He maintained his position through the first hour, a legitimate consulting arrangement, documented services, standard industry practice. Then Barbara's materials were introduced. Wire transfers, email chains between Dex and Stuart discussing how to adjust the reported contract figures on 2 specific projects. A series of text messages between Dex and Raymond, in which Raymond's growing discomfort was documented in language that made it very clear he had understood exactly what was happening. One text from Raymond to Dex read, "This isn't what I agreed to when we started. I want out before someone pays a price none of us can afford." Dex had written back, "You're already in, Ray. Being in is the price. The only question is how it ends." When that text was placed in front of Dex Holloway in the deposition room, his attorneys called a recess. He came back 20 minutes later, a changed man. Not collapsed, he was too experienced for that, but reduced. His answers became shorter. His prior certainty developed fissures. He had claimed Raymond was a knowing and enthusiastic participant with no reservations. The texts showed Raymond, in the months before his death, actively trying to extract himself from the arrangement and being prevented from doing so. He invoked the Fifth Amendment 9 times before the session ended. His attorneys were already negotiating by the time Suzanne called me that evening. Stuart Finch cooperated in exchange for a reduced exposure agreement. Amber Caulfield, it emerged, had known about the bookkeeping irregularities and had participated in the documentation of the inflated figures, but had not been a principal in the scheme. She was named in the civil proceeding, but not in the criminal one. Suzanne called me on a Thursday evening with the formal finding. Helen Calloway, non-culpable third party. No evidence of knowing participation or knowing benefit. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the call ended. Relief is a strange feeling when it is tangled with loss. I was not guilty. That was true, and it mattered, and it was on record in a federal building in downtown Nashville. But being cleared does not give you back the version of your marriage you thought you had. It does not answer every question. It does not make the room that you were locked out of smaller, or the years you spent in the rest of the house without knowing it less real. The indictment came down in March. Dex Holloway faced 5 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, tax evasion, and obstruction. His attorneys negotiated. The plea came in June. 3 counts, with a sentencing recommendation of 6 to 9 years in federal prison and forfeiture of assets totaling $8.4 million, including 2 properties he owned outright and a brokerage account that had been receiving Holloway Capital distributions for years. Stuart Finch entered a separate plea: civil penalties, financial disgorgement of $1.3 million, and a 5-year bar from serving as an officer or director of any publicly reporting company. He would not go to prison. That troubled me somewhat, but Suzanne explained the trade-offs of cooperation agreements patiently, and I made my peace with it. The remaining cash value of Raymond's policy, $218,000 came to me as beneficiary, along with the death benefit. The $340,000 disbursement was subject to a civil forfeiture claim as proceeds of fraud. I did not fight it. It was not money I wanted. Barbara also examined the original estate buyout from Stuart. The $180,000 he had paid me for Raymond's share of Callaway Development was, as she had suspected, significantly undervalued. A civil action resulted in an additional $220,000 being returned to Raymond's estate, which passed to me by operation of law. The total that remained mine after all proceedings concluded was not dramatic by the standards of the story I was learning to tell. But it was mine, in the clearest way anything had been mine in a long time. I established a small trust with the guidance of a financial advisor Suzanne recommended, a practical woman named Gloria Cheng, who did not treat me like I was fragile. I invested conservatively. I set aside a portion for June, which I told her about over a long phone call one Sunday evening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I need to understand all of this. Can I come home?" She came the following weekend. We spent 3 days together, and I told her everything over 2 evenings on the back porch, with decaf and the kind of deliberate honesty that I had learned, at some cost, to practice. She was angry at her father, a clean, honest anger that I recognized because I had felt it too. I did not try to soften Raymond for her. I told her the truth, and I let her sit with it. By the time she left on Sunday afternoon, something between us had shifted. She calls me now on Thursdays in addition to Sundays, easy calls, unhurried. She tells me about her work, her friends, the small decisions she's turning over. And I listen. I have more time to listen now, and I use it. I left my position at the district office in the spring, not abruptly. I stayed through the end of the school year, helped transition my projects, and left with 2 decades of good standing intact. My supervisor, a man I had worked with for 7 years, said at my last staff meeting that I was one of the most careful, principled people he had worked with. I thanked him, and I meant it, and I walked to my car in the parking lot and thought, careful, that word. Raymond had been called careful, too. Careful can mean many things. Carolyn Brewer and I began taking a Saturday morning walk together through the neighborhood. Just 2 miles, nothing ambitious, but it became the kind of ritual that organizes a week around itself. She is dry and funny, and does not ask questions I am not ready to answer, and she makes excellent coffee, which she always has waiting when we get back. I took a class at the community center in the fall, watercolor painting, which I had never tried and which I was spectacularly bad at for the first 3 sessions. My paintings looked like weather events. The instructor, a patient man who had clearly seen worse, told me that the point was not technique, but attention. That painting taught you to look at things more carefully than you had before. I thought about that on the drive home and decided it was true of most worthwhile things. Dex Holloway reported to a federal correctional facility in October. I read the news item over my morning coffee and set my phone down and went to water the patio plants I had started keeping that summer. I had nothing left to feel about him specifically. He had made his choices over many years. The accounting had simply arrived. Stuart Finch, I heard from Barbara some months later, had sold his home in Franklin and relocated out of state. His reputation in the local development community had not survived the civil proceedings. That was not a satisfaction I particularly wanted, but it was a fact. Amber Caulfield had left the industry entirely. I bore her no specific anger. She had made choices she would have to carry. That was enough. June flew home for Christmas. We cooked a meal together in the kitchen that I had repainted in November, A warm, quiet sage green, the color I'd wanted for years and never done anything about. We played music while we cooked and didn't talk about anything hard. We talked about the things she was excited about, and the books I had been reading, and a trip I was thinking about taking in the spring, somewhere with a lot of light and old architecture, maybe Portugal or southern Spain. Raymond had always found a reason to delay travel. Too busy. Wrong season. Next year would be better. I was done waiting for next year. I was 51 years old. I drove the same Subaru. I was not a woman who had expected any of what had happened to her in the past 18 months. But I had moved through it, the way I had tried to teach my students to move through hard texts, not looking away, not flinching from the difficult parts, asking the questions even when the answers were uncomfortable. There is a particular kind of knowing that comes from surviving something you were not sure you could survive. Not triumph exactly, not the clean resolution of a problem solved. Something quieter and more permanent than that. The knowledge of what you are made of when the ordinary scaffolding of your life falls away. I had stood in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and had the floor drop out from under me. I had not fallen. I had found solid ground and stood on it and made the choices I could live with. That was enough, more than enough. That was mine.